Stories That Matter. The journey of life from birth to death is an extraordinary trip, sometimes filled with great joy and excitement, but at other times filled with pain, sorrow, and disappointment. Stories That Matter shares both extremes with you. Sometimes our stories will make you feel very happy, but the journey of life is not all happiness. Other times, the journey of life will make you feel sad, for all of us have experienced both extremes. Stories That Matter will begin right after the break with a story that will touch your heart in the journey of life.
Welcome to Stories That Matter. I'm your host, Doug Thompson, with my special guest today, Mark Brende. Mark, thank you so much for stopping in. I know you're on your way back from Colorado and you're spending a little bit of time in this area.
Correct, yeah.
And so share with the people first, tell us a little about your family, how you wound up in Colorado, what's been your ministry background.
Yeah, okay. So I'm married to Jenny, and we have 4 kids.
We're going to put the pictures of your family up on the screen.
Oh, you are? Okay. So Samuel, Ben, Abby, and Ethan, 15 down to 8. And yeah, it's a pretty great time in terms of lots of energy in the house, lots of changes happening, trying to keep up with needs and, you know, from a large spectrum of things going on in their lives. And so we're based just outside of Boulder, Colorado, and primarily where I work. I just dropped them off at Kanakuk camps, and so I'm here in the area.
Okay, is your wife back with you?
You know, she is on a trip right now with my daughter in Europe.
Oh, awesome.
And it's kind of a once in a lifetime, always wanted to do this trip. And so I'm really excited for the time they're having together.
What part of Europe is she in?
They're in Paris.
Oh, boy. There's so many scary things, you know, when
Yeah.
you listen to it, because I have friends and relatives who will travel overseas and you say, oh man, they've just been through London, and prior to that they were in Paris for a while, and of course you hear about all of the terrorist attacks. And it's scary.
It is.
It's a scary world right now.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so the other kids are at camp, and you're what, headed to Kansas City next?
I'm headed to Kansas City, and I'll be there for the next couple of days before I pick them up at camp and back to Colorado.
And you're going to probably see your twin, Alicia Mock?
I will see my twin, yes, tomorrow. And she's a pretty special girl.
Oh, she's very special, and we've seen her from the time you and her were much, much younger than you are now.
Yeah.
And watched you guys perform. You're both musically talented. The whole family's musically talented.
True.
Tell me about the, well, now I can do the bragging. It's not so good when you do the bragging.
Okay.
But you are. Tell me about how you got into the ministry.
Yeah, so, you know, I started out with a personal story with a campus ministry background.
In college?
In college,
was that in college when you got in with the campus?
Yeah. In college, I actually had a pretty profound conversion through a ministry that after I graduated my undergrad, I joined full-time with. And so my wife and I worked for over a decade with that organization, primarily in Kansas City, until we were called out to Colorado to fulfill a role in that organization. And there's a backstory behind this, but I made a shift just a year later to join an organization to really work in prevention of child exploitation and human trafficking. And my story behind that, because I'm asked the question all the time, well, Mark, I mean, why human trafficking? I mean, that seems kind of like narrow. How would you end up doing that? And this is a story I've just started telling, and I feel like it's important to be honest, but it helps people understand where empathy comes from, at least in my life. And when I was living in Topeka at a party as a younger guy, I had a pretty rough journey for the most part. I was a high school dropout, so by the age of 17, 18 years old, I was shooting crystal meth in my arm with other people doing the same thing. Dangerous circles of people that really just had no boundaries in terms of what they were willing to do, and I was one of those people. And in the course of that, had kind of a reckless path of relationships and things that I had done to other people.
Oh, well, absolutely. I see that as I'm an attorney and I'm a judge, I see it a lot, that the drug usage and it just spirals. That was obviously before the conversion.
Yeah, and I had a sobering moment happen at a party where I had actually received a date rape drug from a guy, and when I woke up paralyzed and could do nothing about what I knew, what was happening to me, I couldn't even utter a word. It doesn't leave you. That experience it in some ways defines you the rest of your life.
How old were you?
21.
21. And you were a dropout from high school, weren't in college at the time then?
I was not, no. And it was later that year that I had a pretty radical conversion and understanding that the shame that I was carrying, the deep sense of sin that was on me. I came across a verse at a conference that was actually a big banner that showed up, and it was from the book of John, chapter 1:29. And John the Baptist, on the scene, sees Jesus and says, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." And I'm like, he takes it away, and so that was a moment that changed my life.
Man, we're going to cut away. We're going to take a break. We'll be right back. You're listening to Mark Brende. Welcome back to Stories That Matter. I'm your host, Doug Thompson, with my special guest, Mark Brende. Mark, before we cut away to break, you had told a story about there was a period of time in your life as a young man. You dropped out of high school, got into the party scene, and was abused in that party scene. And then there was a banner that you saw, and at some point in time, tell us about that conversion that you made, because you mentioned it very early when we started. I've heard about, of course, the drug usage, and there's evil people around. There's people who are possessed at the time, and there are people who are at different stages in their life that the drug usage and things really doesn't define them, and they make changes later. And that's kind of the case for you, wasn't it?
Yeah. I like to say that my life is a story of the power of empathy. Ironically, I work with an organization that is the essence of everything we do is empathy. And my story leading up to that had everything to do with my twin sister and her empathy. We took very radical different paths. She was an honor student. She was involved in drama. She went on to K-State and became a great student there.
Yeah, she was one of the K-State singers with Mark Schultz.
That's right.
Yeah, Alicia, very, very talented. I've always thought the world of both of you, of your whole family.
Yeah. And meanwhile, thanks, by the way. And I was just living in Topeka with this kind of deep sense of shame that covered over me, and I was living that out, and with the deep identity crisis going on with me, and I just felt ultimately that I had no value as a person, that I had no future, and so it was just living a life that I thought would end shortly. Well, she saw me, and when she had really a profound turn in her life in terms of becoming a Christian at a Bible study on her dorm floor, she got involved with the same organization I ended up working with for a decade, and she came after me, and she didn't come after me with just truth and Mark, you need to shape up, but she came after me with tears and with just a deep sense of understanding my value that I couldn't see. She, in a sense, could see me through the lens of God who was living in her. And her message to me for the course of 2 years as she went after me was, "Mark, I see you and I know your value. I know what you're worth. I know what you're worth. I know what you're worth." And 2 years later, I'm like, really, I want to know. and I'm willing to hear what you
Was
have to
that the
say.
Lord speaking through her directly to you?
It really was. It really was. So
You didn't know it at the time.
I didn't, and she ended up dragging me to the conference where I actually heard that verse, that banner that was shared in that first segment of John chapter 1, verse 29.
And I know that, of course, Alicia's amazingly talented with music and singing, and I've seen her and Carrie's kids, and they're amazingly talented too.
Totally.
Your family, obviously, that's not just something you just sort of pick up and can sing and do other stuff. So you had to be trained in that area as a young child moving up, weren't you?
Yeah, well, most of my family was, and I was with the violin. So I started when I was 6 years old and played really for 10 years, and I probably was a decent violinist by my freshman year in high school, but I put it in my locker that summer of my freshman year and never picked it up again. Really very lost at that time. And so it wasn't until years later that I picked up music again, and it became a very large part of my life.
Did that open doors for you with Campus Crusade?
It certainly did. And I was coming to conferences after that first year of having that experience, and I sang at conferences every year after that, and started writing music that was related to my story and what God was doing in my life. And so my sisters and I also together, we put together 4 CDs in that process, and had a great journry.
If somebody wants to get your CD, we're going to put that information on the screen right now, so that they can get it and listen to it, because it's an amazing story that you're sharing with us, and it's a very tough story. So when your sister came to you, and in essence God was speaking through her, or Jesus, or both, were speaking through her to you, did that your first then ministry work, was it with Campus Crusade or another organization?
It was with Campus Crusade. Well, I should say that I worked with the state for 2 years, the state of Kansas, as an emergency transportation unit for kids in SRS custody.
Sure.
So kids that were on their way out of their home because their parents were being taken to jail or whatever. I was the guy showing up at the scene to help that kid get to their next location.
Picking them up, and you'd hear their stories and their cries and their tears.
Absolutely.
You'd see their tears, because boy, it's terribly disruptive for the kids, and they're going through a difficult time. I would think also that with your experiences as you're talking to kids at Campus Crusade, because there's kids that are nowhere in their walk with the Lord, and when you start sharing with them, well, I've got to think that's effective for the kids.
Well, it helps to, have been there, and you can say, I empathize. I've been in your shoes, and I get it.
So how did you wind up out at Boulder?
Yeah, well, so the organization I was working with asked me to take a role there to direct the campus of CU Boulder, and so that was initially what brought me out there. And ironically, that year we had brought in another organization to one of our conferences to really talk about this issue of human trafficking and child sex exploitation. And when I saw the images of some girls that had been exploited in Southeast Asia, it brought back a lot for me, because one story I didn't share earlier was that I had also, in that same year that I had received that date rape drug, had gone to Thailand and had seen things that I just didn't know existed, and namely one girl in particular who I met, who I knew that in her eyes that she didn't want to be there, that she was in a very dark place, and that people were abusing her. And so seeing her again in that conference moved me to want to take part in this mission of ending child exploitation.
We're going to talk about that when we come back from break. You're watching Stories That Matter. I'm your host, Doug Thompson, with my special guest, Mark Brende. Welcome back to Stories That Matter. I'm your host, Doug Thompson, with my special guest, Mark Brende. If you've missed the first part of this, you'll be able to watch for one of the replays because it's an interesting story. And Mark, we were just talking about you and moving the family out to Boulder, Colorado as part of Campus Crusade. And then while you're out there, you go to one of the events, and the conversation and the whole program probably was about sex trafficking. Is that pretty accurate?
Right.
Okay, and while you were there, you saw somebody that you had seen overseas.
Mm-hmm.
Pick it up from there.
Yeah, so I was invited to have an encounter with a girl when I was in Thailand.
And encounter means?
She was in a brothel.
Gotcha.
And it's a 21-year-old hungry guy looking for validation. It seemed appealing, seemed like it might have an answer for me and where I was at the time. And when I went to meet that girl, what I did not expect was to see her eyes. So when she dropped her robe, I, for some reason, looked straight into her eyes, and I saw a darkness that just haunted me, and
an emptiness in her?
Absolutely. And I realized I was going to be the next guy to do this to her.
To use her.
Right. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I got to get out of here. And ran out of that hotel, down an alleyway, pouring down rain. I said, I don't want to be this guy anymore. And so when we came across this issue at this conference, I saw that girl's eyes again, and it was very clear to me that this wasn't going to leave me, and I needed to be involved at some level, some way. And so I had a great opportunity to meet some pretty amazing people working within this issue, and had the opportunity to step in and have a role. So we're based out of Boulder now, and I work with an organization called iEmpathize.
And what do they do?
So iEmpathize, not a faith-based organization. Primarily, it's an opportunity for us to work with law enforcement, to work with educators, healthcare providers, universities, churches, anybody that wants to step into this issue, and you have influence, you have power, you have an ability to recognize and respond to this issue in a way that can make a difference. We want to work with you. We want to collaborate with you. And so iEmpathize works primarily in prevention, and we work to empower adults, to empower youth with strategies to be safe from exploitation.
Okay, so it's an awareness program in part.
In part. I think that's the first
the smallest
door.
Part of it.
But our main objective is that we want everybody to be involved in this issue as somebody who is empowering others to recognize and respond. So primarily youth, and so we have an empowerment youth program. It's called the Empower Youth Program, and you can find it at empower.iempathize.org, and it's a media toolkit for any educator, anybody working directly with youth, to really facilitate this conversation, to navigate negative pushes and pulls that kids are going to encounter, and to distinguish what a disguise looks like, that a kid, a relationship they might be in, how do you know that they have the best intentions for you? How do you know that they aren't an exploiter?
Yeah, wanting to use you.
And today with kids online 48 hours a day, and we know that there are hundreds of thousands of predators looking for children. It's a conversation that needs to be had, and so we're excited that in over 21 states now, our Empower Youth Program is being used, and we hope that'll be true across Kansas and Nebraska also.
And that contact information that you just mentioned is on the screen right now as we're talking about it.
Great.
Well, all right. So, tell me the differences that you feel like the organization has made, because it's one thing for awareness, and I know from the program that that's only a small part of it. But
Right.
you've physically gone out into areas and pulled kids away from this mess, haven't you?
Well,
In different terms than what I'm saying.
Right. So we've worked a lot in Mexico City,
Yes.
and we partnered up with advocates there that really are doing incredible things. And at the time, when we first got there, in Mexico in particular, there was very little acknowledgement that human trafficking even existed. And if anybody was involved in that issue, they want it to be. And so there was a great movement that emerged as we partnered up with people of advocates saying human trafficking is a problem, we need to do something about it in our country. And so we had the privilege of seeing in some of our efforts hundreds of girls get rescued out of the sex trade in an international district where it was very common to go into a brothel and find 200 girls. Today, that brothel doesn't exist, it's gone. And that's pretty exciting. We partner with an organization called Connection Mosaico, and they are working to pilot our Empower Youth program that's been translated into Spanish in areas where kids are incredibly vulnerable. And we're excited to see what's going to happen with that. It's really our first pilot of our Spanish translation, and hopefully we'll find out here in the next couple months what kind of impact that's having.
And I remember when you went to Mexico City, because I remember my wife and I praying for you down there, and
wow,
I said,
thanks.
well, this isn't Campus Crusade anymore, Campus, because I understood what that was from having kids in college. But did you get to address the legislature? And
well, we had the privilege of bringing in our exhibit, which we have in Spanish and in English, and it's an exhibit I tour across the country. It's called the Apathy Effect exhibit, and you can also find that on our website at iEmpathize.org. And it really allows anybody to enter into this issue in a very abstract way through film, photography, and artifacts. And we brought this in to a time when Senate was moving legislation and considering bills to be passed, and so it was a neat opportunity to see men who perhaps had not acknowledged this as an important issue being moved to say, this is an issue I want to change in my country.
Yeah. We got to cut away and take a break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Stories That Matter. I'm your host, Doug Thompson, with my special guest, Mark Brende. If you haven't been in for the start of this, you've missed a fantastic show. You can watch for some of the replays on the system, and you'll be able to go to the website also and take a look at it. Mark, what do you want the folks that are sitting at home and they say, well, okay, sex trafficking, all right, how does that pertain to me? Where from here?
Well, you know, we all have a role in this issue, and it's vital that we're all a part because we all live in a home space, a workspace, and social space where this issue exists. And we have a voice in that space. Our voice matters. We would say that apathy is what feeds this issue. It's a disregard for people suffering for their value. And when you have apathetic environments, you're going to find exploitation. People with sympathy, which most of us would fit into that category of feeling badly, but we're somehow disassociated because we don't know what to do, perhaps. It's inactive, it just doesn't do anything. So how do we become people of empathy? It's about entering into the shoes of people in our home space, in our workspace, in our social space in a way that we will elevate their value, and we can say, your suffering matters, I'm going to walk with you. And when we find spaces where empathy exists, at a truck stop, a rest stop, in a high school, with law enforcement, you're going to find redemption, you're going to find intervention, you're going to find people taking action to make sure exploitation does not happen here. And if you're that person that's contributing to this issue with your empathy, you're making a difference. So how can you create a movement of empathy in your space is a question I really want to ask everybody.
Okay. Mark, we're out of time, but thank you so much for not only walking the talk, but talking the talk and walking it as well.
Well,
You're
thanks.
doing it. Thank you so much. Hope you've enjoyed.